Hello guys, and welcome to another video, and in this one we're going to be taking a break from the Keystone highlight series to talk about a bit of something else. And a while back I ran a poll where I asked you guys which Ascendancy would you like to see reworked the most in patch 3.22, and this poll came about largely due to something that Chris Wilson said in the Crucible Q&A with Ziggy D after the reveal livestream. If you missed that part, you can check out this video that I made on it. But what Chris essentially said is that they had planned to do more Ascendancy reworks in Crucible League to go with the Pathfinder and Saboteur, but ultimately they weren't happy with how polished these changes were, so they didn't release them. And Chris went on to say that he had hoped that many of these Ascendancy reworks would be ready for release in 3.22. So it's quite likely that we'll be getting more Ascendancy reworks in 3.22. And how many we actually end up getting, well, your guess is as good as mine. But one of the big questions is, which Ascendancies are likely to be reworked? Well, the poll asked which Ascendancy you'd like to see reworked the most in 3.22, and quite a few of you voted, and the Gladiator had a clear majority here with the other options coming out fairly even. And I think most would agree that the Gladiator is the Ascendancy that is in the most dire need of a rework at this point. It has suffered through 6 leagues since the changes to Versatile Combatant in 3.16, and the changes to melee in general in the league prior to that. And in my mind, the Gladiator is without doubt the weakest Ascendancy in Path of Exile right now, so I really do hope that 3.22 is going to bring changes to this Ascendancy. But what exactly would a Gladiator rework look like? We know that the changes made to Saboteur and Pathfinder in Crucible League aligned with the developers' goals to simplify Ascendancy nodes to have only 1 or 2 impactful stats, and we can largely see that across those 2 Ascendancies now. So let's take a bit of a look. I'll talk about the current class and what I think is important with the class right now, and then I'll discuss what I'd like to see reworked on the class. So this is the current Gladiator Ascendancy class. I know I haven't included the small notes here. They are important, of course, but I think that mostly those will stay the same even after the rework. And I think one thing that's really important when it comes to reworking an Ascendancy is to maintain the identity of the class. And what's the identity of Gladiator? Well, I think you could ask any Path of Exile player this question and they would almost all say blocking and bleeding. Those are the 2 specialties of the class, and it's important to keep that even in the reworked class. So I think immediately looking at the Gladiator, the bleed arm here, the blood in the eyes and gratuitous violence, these need to stay in some shape or form. The bleed explosions are a very important part of Gladiator, and I think the blood in the eyes notable could probably see some changes largely to slim this down to 2 or 3 impactful stats. But overall, these 2 nodes together are a core part of Gladiator, and I think that should stay that way even in the reworked Gladiator. And then we have Outmatch and Outlast. This is probably one of the weaker nodes on Gladiator, and I think this one just needs to go away. The whole main hand and offhand thing going on here doesn't really mesh well with the current Path of Exile, and I don't feel that the Gladiator needs to have any kind of interaction with Frenzy or Endurance charges. And I know that right now the limited number of Gladiator builds are actually using this notable quite often, but realistically that's because the entire block branch is quite weak, especially compared to how it once was. So this is more like a choice between 2 weak nodes, between Outmatch and Outlast and Painforge for those builds, because they're definitely taking the bleed nodes and Arena Challenger. But I'd like to see Outmatch and Outlast removed to make room for some more interesting options. And since I mentioned Arena Challenger, this one has to stay. I think if bleed and block are the core identity of the class, this node comes very close to being a part of that. However, I would make changes to this node. I think the stance thing going on here is a bit of a gimmick. So this node should just grant Challenger charges on kill, and maybe a 50% chance to grant a Challenger charge when hitting a rare or unique enemy. Forget the stance requirements, that's unnecessary. And that brings us to the block branch. So this is Painforge, which then branches into Reigning Veteran or Violent Retaliation. Let's first talk about Painforge, because I actually think this node has an interesting modifier which should be explored a little bit more, and that's the modifier which grants your counterattacks deal double damage. I think it would be really interesting if they honed in on counterattacks as a core part of the Gladiator class, but the problem here is that there's really a huge lack of support for that type of archetype in the game right now, but maybe they can start building on it. And one thing I would like to say about this node is that the counterattacks modifier should be something like your counterattacks deal 100% more damage, so that they can interact with bleed and apply bleeds which benefit from this modifier, because right now the double damage stat does nothing for bleeding, and I think that's a shame. The stun immunity on blocked hits is fine, thematically it works, it makes sense, and you have some attack block too, which is nice. And what's really important though is the two nodes that branch off from this one, starting with Reigning Veteran. Now we all know how important this node used to be back when it was Versatile Combatant. So here's what I'd like to see happening with Reigning Veteran. First of all, the armor and evasion stat can go away, get that one out of here, and I think the 10% maximum attack block chance should stay. That's a great modifier, and I want to see 2 extra modifiers added onto this node. And these should be something like modifiers to chance to block attack damage also apply to chance to block spell damage at 50% of their value, and modifiers to maximum chance to block attack damage also apply to maximum chance to block spell damage at 50% of their value. This would restore some of what Versatile Combatant used to be, whilst being mindful of what is also obtainable in the current game, things like spell suppression, maximum resistance, and the likes. And Violent Retaliation, well, how do I say this? This modifier is just trash. There's really not a nice way to say it. It's just bad and it needs to go. Alright, so what would replace Outmatch and Outlast and Violent Retaliation? Well, let's switch over to this, my new reworked Gladiator, and let's see what we've got. So I've made the changes here that I'd like to see on the nodes that are staying. We've got the Pain Forged 100% more damage on counterattacks instead of double damage. The removal of the stance prerequisites on the Arena Challenger notable. And the new modifiers adding to Reigning Veteran for chance to block and maximum chance to block, also applying to spell block at 50% of their values. And keeping Blood in the Eyes and Gratuitous Violence. I think that's really, really important. And what about this new notable here that I've added, Weapons Expert? This is one thing that I really want to see on the Gladiator Ascendancy, and this will really help it to distinguish itself from the other Ascendancies and make it very unique with bleed. The ability for all damage to inflict bleeding. So it'll be a bit like the pneumatic dagger where elemental damage can inflict poison with that weapon, but this will allow you to use elemental damage or chaos damage on weapons to inflict bleeding. And this would just be such a great addition to Gladiator, and I think it thematically makes sense as well. The Gladiator is supposed to be this arena champion, someone who's really, really good at combat, able to use any weapon, and I think this is the one stat that I want to see the most on this class out of everything. And for Violent Retaliation, it keeps its name because I think it's appropriate. And I like the idea that Pain Forged is a notable that has important modifiers for both blocking and counter-attacks. And then you have Reigning Veteran, which is all about improving blocking. And Violent Retaliation is all about counter-attacks. And as I said, this is an archetype that I'd like to see a lot more support for generally in the game. So whenever your counter-attacks trigger, they trigger an additional time ignoring cooldowns. This is exactly what it says. So your counterattacks basically proc twice whenever they proc. Too powerful? Maybe, but it's a fun addition. I think you can easily modify this if it is too powerful. You can have it the same sort of trigger bots treatment where you get some less damage with counterattacks or something like that. And chance to trigger counterattacks is lucky. This stat would only apply to Vengeance at the moment, but I'm hopeful that in the future other counterattack abilities will be coming into the game, along with more support for this archetype in the future as well, because it is an interesting concept that I would like to see explored further. And that's it. That's the sort of thing I'd like to see on a reworked Gladiator in 3.22. Of course, there is the other topic to talk about, which is bleed, and I do think the bleed calculation needs to be changed, a bit like Ignite was a while back. I think bleed right now is quite weak. But they may be able to solve that in some other ways, some different additions to skills. If you think back to pre-3.15, the war cries were pretty much propping up bleed on their own. Things like bleed slams were purely propped up by these massive more damage multipliers on war cries. So I do think the bleed archetype needs a little bit of love, and maybe the calculation itself needs a bit of an improvement. But this is one of my favourite Ascendancies in the game, and it's just in a really bad place right now. It needs a lot of love. What do you guys think of these ideas for a reworked Gladiator class? And what sort of modifiers would you like to see Gladiator have in the future? Do you think it should remain focused around blocks and bleeding? Or maybe you feel that it should move entirely into a different direction? Let me know by commenting below, and remember to like and subscribe and ring the bell to be notified whenever I post a new video. And you can help me grow this channel by becoming a channel member just like Frank Blanco and Kevin M. Click the join button below to find out more. Thanks for watching. And as always, stay tuned and stay safe.